Welcome everyone. Welcome to this Inclusive Leadership Conversation series. This is the first of two in the series, and we want to say thanks to McGraw Hill and Schulich for facilitating the space for this conversation. I'm Michel Shah. I'm facilitator at Schulich, faculty at George Brown College, and lead upskiller at UpSkill Community. I'm going to be the facilitator for this session today, and I'm joining you from my home, located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and other Indigenous people who have lived here over time. I'm really grateful to be able to share this land with you to learn, live, and work together as all relatives. Joining me on screen is Joanne the Chawla of Schulich, and Joanne will be taking any questions you have throughout, and she will certainly also follow up with you afterwards, any questions you have related to the program as well. My very special guest is Neil Harris, and he's the Managing Director of the Canadian Operations for McGraw Hill. And today, Neil has opted to put himself out front on a very difficult topic, a very interesting topic. And so I want to welcome you to this conversation. We only have half an hour, and so we're going to jump right in. As we jump in, just want to let you know, use the chat to share your own ideas, to share your thoughts, and to contribute your questions, not only for this particular session, but for subsequent series. As well, post in the chat how you rate yourself in terms of inclusive leadership on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. Where do you think you are right now? Welcome to the conversation, Neil.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm grateful to be in your presence.
This is a very complex topic, huge topic. Most people don't understand it. Most people are afraid to even talk about it. And so we avoid it, but we're brave, we're courageous today. We're going to actually have the conversation. And so where do we begin when we talk about inclusive leadership? This fuzzy term, most people don't understand the concept, the practice, but we as leaders are charged to be inclusive. And Harvard has done some research which suggests that we're not even fully able to accurately assess the level at which we are inclusive. 1/3 of leaders that they surveyed were able to accurately assess their abilities as inclusive leaders. 1/3 overestimated it, and another 1/3 underestimated it. So this is really challenging for us, Neil. So go ahead.
It is very challenging for all of us. And I think, Michelle, like, what is inclusive leadership? What is the starting point? What is the end point? How do I be an inclusive leader? Those are all big, meaty challenges for us all as our society and our organizations, and for us personally, as we continue to navigate this fine world.
Yes, so inclusive leadership is a simpler definition than what it means to execute it. So I think that also that is part of where our problem comes in, because we define it in a sentence or two, but it takes a lifetime to become an inclusive leader. And that's part of the challenge and part of what makes it so fuzzy to others and make people really feel challenged by this concept. But fundamentally, it's about us understanding, first of all, awareness and understanding of barriers, and a commitment and effort to remove those barriers. That's really what inclusive leadership is in a nutshell. But it goes further, though, at the practical level. That's sort of conceptually. But at the practical level, then we need to think about how do we as leaders lead organizations where complex, very, very complex, conflicting ideas, identities, ideologies, ideals must sit together side by side respectfully, where difference and unity must coexist. How do we, that is the charge of inclusive leadership. How do you make sure that all of that happens in one space while we move towards the goal of productivity? And it's really about understanding that there's a space between performance and people that we're missing. Inclusive leadership brings the people who are responsible for the performance onto the table. So there's a lot to do there. So what do you think are some of the challenges leaders are facing when they hear this term, this concept, inclusive leadership, when they're asked to demonstrate it? What are some of the challenges you think leaders are dealing with, Neil?
Oh, I think leaders are struggling with an eloquent definition of it. I think we're struggling, Michelle, with what's the pathway? How do I understand the different components of inclusive leadership? How do I understand all the experiences and the exposures that are in my workplace and the different attributes that team members are bringing? How do I create safe places for individuals to express their ideas, to work with one another? I think the challenges are immense as we think about inclusive leadership and how we bring action to it, not just optics, how we make things actionable.
Wow. Yeah. Actionable, real, rather than ideal. Right. And, I like to say inclusive leadership is the elephant in the room. And so then when we are thinking about the elephant, how do we tackle this elephant? How do we eat an elephant? As you know, Einstein, who asked about this question, it's one bite at a time. And so although it is a big, complex topic, the beginning point for inclusive leadership is commitment to it. It's to recognize that it's not something that you're going to walk into your office, go into a training or so on and show up and it's going to happen automatically. Inclusive leadership is a skill. In fact, it's a meta skill. It's a set of skills that come together to produce this outcome. And a lot of leaders have studied leadership at a time when this wasn't even a conversation. And so now we have to go back and get this new skill to be able to superimpose it over what we know leadership to have been. Because what has changed is not leadership per se, it's who we're leading. And so we as leaders have to change to deal with who we are leading, right? Because the leader has to flex their leadership style to be able to meet the needs of the people within their particular organization. And so even as we speak about inclusive leadership, it shows up in different ways in different organizations. So each leader has to come with an awareness of who they are and what the context that they're in requires. Because some people need to do far more than others. And some people are further along this journey than others because we're not all at the same place. And so there's a lot of I in the inclusive leadership component. There is I understanding your personal identity, how that plays a role in how you lead, in how you're perceived, in how your inclusive leadership is perceived. There is I, the individual, understanding that we cannot bring our generalizations and assumptions of large groups of people to bear on the individuals. We need to take time to get to know the individuals, their stories, their needs in order to include them, in order to demonstrate that they're valued and that they belong, which is the outcome of inclusive leadership. But then we're asking about more time, which leaders are saying, where do you get that from? I barely have time to move the widgets that I need to move, never mind to go and learn about each of the individuals in the organization. And so leaders have to come with that curiosity, with that creativity, with that collaboration, that commitment. We have to come with that, the cultural humility, to be able to identify ways and means of getting to know our people so that we can meet them where they are at and find inclusive ways to engage them, to collaborate with them, to allow them to make sure that they are equal contributors to the conversation. So Neil, what are some of the challenges that you see that leaders really have beyond the definition? When the rubber hits the road inside the organization, what are the challenges?
I think the one you've mentioned already, right? Performance versus people. How do we spend the time meeting individuals, getting feedback from individuals, right? Recognizing the uniqueness of individuals and gaining that feedback from team members. Michelle, we do these great surveys where we reach out within our organization, get feedback. They're the classic kind of pulse surveys, get some feedback, and we get that feedback and we analyze it. But how do we make it actionable? What do we do next with all that feedback that we get? And we have mass amounts of feedback. What do we do with that? What's the next steps? Those are some of the challenges that we see and I see as we navigate being inclusive of organization and with our team members and with the society we operate and work within.
And so what's the goal of the survey? What's the goal of the feedback? Why are we collecting this feedback? What are we hoping to achieve? What do we want to learn? And you know, what is it?
We want to learn about where our team members are at. You know, we want to ensure that we're meeting their needs, meeting them where they are at, that we are developing policies and structures that engage our team members so that we're not faced with things like quiet quitting, retention challenges. We want to ensure that we're representing our team members, that we're getting their views on the table in order that we can deal with the complexities that we're faced with. We want to ensure that we can get feedback so we can be innovative, right? If we can't communicate and collaborate, how are we going to be innovative as a team and organization? Those are the main goals of where we do feedback, and we do feedback through surveys, one-on-ones, meeting with teams, but we're always looking to gather that feedback to be a better organization, to better serve our people, and to better serve the communities we live and work in.
Yeah, so feedback is fundamental to inclusive leadership, because you can't include people if you don't know how they want to be included, because that's the other thing that's important. Not everybody wants to be included the way that you may perceive inclusion. So different people have different needs around inclusion. Some people want to be part of the decision making. That's an important component of it. Some people want to make sure that there's community that they're involved with on an ongoing basis. So what are the strategies that we're putting, like reviewing what our mission is, what our vision is, what our goals are, what our values are, and figuring out how are we implementing this across the organization? These are things that are going to be important, because inclusive leadership is not a standalone branch. It's this, you know, it's not this, the DEI section over here that's responsible for that. This is something that when we're talking about people, we're talking about all of our people. And how are we ensuring that all of our people are feeling included? Because the risk that we face is now the leader comes in and he wants to be inclusive, but he gets a pushback from some employees feeling like there's going to be a threat to their career pathway, their career trajectory, when you're opening up doors for people who were not usually at the table to come to the table. How do you deal with that, Neil? Because this is the back and forth in that is causing some of the challenges with the leaders being able to move forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Michelle. And I think to me, the words that always cross my mind there are authentic, right? So being authentic so people can see both the good and the bad, right? Both the polished, you know, the polished of a Neil Harris out there in front, but also the unpolished. Like Neil Harris is not all this strength, right? There's no way. There's weakness, there's moments, there's things I don't do well, right? So being able to show an authentic side to individuals and be your as one of our colleagues here in the Canadian organization, about your authentic self, right? And challenges us all on that. And I think that's a really important component for people to not just see the polish of somebody, but to see heart, soul as well.
Yeah, so that's really important, because actually the research suggests that that's one of the number one things that people within an organization want to see of the leader. They want to see a leader that is real, a leader that opens up about the challenges that they have, the areas that they don't know, but that they're willing to learn, and that if they're going to make mistakes and they need that support. That's the number one thing that people in the raters in the research done by Harvard highlighted as rather important for perceiving a leader as inclusive, because it breaks down that power structure of the leader as the sage on the stage and everybody else looking up to the leader. It brings the leader down to the level of, I'm human too, and the leader also needs support. An inclusive environment cannot be created by one leader. It's shared leadership across the organization. And so the leader being willing to do what you're talking about, Neil, being authentic and coming down and having this conversation is a really key piece. So now I wanna say this now. It's easy for the leader who has the power, who has less at risk, to be authentic, to show up not knowing, to show up sharing and putting themselves out there and taking the risk. What about people who don't have that power, who are concerned about holding on to that job, who are not feeling safe psychologically to open up and be authentic? It's that this is not, I don't know if I can take the risk to make that mistake, to say I don't know, to open up, because there is someone who has power over this position that pays my mortgage, that sends my children to school, that pays my loans. So how do we deal with that, where there is power in the space, there's differential in terms of power, and not everyone feels safe to show up authentically? The risk is too high for some. What do you say?
The challenge, right? Where we all come from different perspectives and different views, right? I think we all our experience of our exposures in our life that we've had, right? Where we're born, who we're born to with, is such great factors in our identity, Michelle, and being able to have that safe space, right? And how do we think about that from, an organization, a leadership perspective, to help those individuals where maybe they're not feeling safe, right? What programs, what policies, how do we create different pathways to communicate with those individuals to help them? That's incumbent upon us as leaders, right? Communication's an interesting art these days, I would suggest, right? It's how it's kind of like driving a car sometimes, Michelle. I think that, how many people are bad drivers, are going to put up their hand and say, I'm a bad driver? How many people are going to say, I'm a bad communicator? There's very few, but we hear it all the time around number one challenges is communication, collaboration, right? And it's up to us as leaders to work with those individuals who maybe don't feel safe, and for very valid reasons. But how do we help those individuals? How do we create the spaces and the pathways to be able to make it more open and inclusive for those individuals?
And so, you've touched on some of the very important concepts and skills. As I mentioned earlier, inclusive leadership is a meta skill, a combination of several big skills. And in a way, the skills that are sort of coming together to form inclusive leadership are meta skills in themselves, like communication, like collaboration, which you've talked about. These are all big skills which we really have to pay attention to. One of the things that I'm going to add here, Neil, is that it's the leader has a new role. The leader has a new role, because, I've been talking about the leader originally needed to be something, needed to be honest, needed to be resourceful, needed to be responsive, to be caring. And then we kind of went to a place where the leader needed to deliver results, to collaborate, to. Now the leader needs to create. The leader now is a designer of culture. The leader is like an architect, an engineer, engineering psychologically safe spaces, using that design thinking approach, centering people and designing spaces, policies, practices around people. This is where we've come now. And that is going to be important, because the research that Harvard produces suggests that 70%, Neil, this is going to be very scary, 70%, the leader makes up that difference in terms of people's feeling of inclusion. 70% of it rests on the leader, the leader. That is a heavy load on one person. That is a very heavy load for a leader to be responsible for 70% of how people feel in the organization. The feeling of inclusion that any one individual experiences rests 70% on the leader. No stress, no pressure, no.
That's responsibility. That is accountability in the modern era.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why the leader must engage with shared leadership, collaborative leadership, understanding that one person cannot take all of that, but can certainly lead that, engineer that, navigate that, be the architect of that, creating that environment where people can show up, make mistakes, learn from them, talk about this, share their stories, so that they're known at the individual level and not known by theories that govern different stereotypes, which is one of the most significant blocks, obstacles to inclusive leadership, stereotypes. And so how do we take all of this, Neil, and think about the leaders need to develop greater inclusive leadership skills? The literature looks at this as a critical capability. What can leaders do to ensure that they're developing the skill? What do you think, Neil, on the ground? What can leaders do on the ground?
I think leaders themselves always need to be learning, right? I can't tell you, Michelle and Joanne, the number of classes and courses I've done, my education background, all those things, but it's always evolving. It needs to be evolving as we think about the needs of our society and our team members, right? So always be learning as a leader, right, is huge. You chatted about inclusivity and thinking about that. And one of the professors, I was in a course recently, Michelle, and one of their direct advice to me was, and it went this way, and it said, you know, you say you want to walk in somebody's shoes, but it implies you're taking off your shoes, right? And how do I take off my shoes, right? How do I do that in the modern world to actually be able to walk in somebody else's shoes? I think it's talking with individuals, right? I think it's not being afraid. I'm on an assignment currently, very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with our team in Asia. And it's about talking with people at an individual level, at a small team level, at a mass level, to get feedback, to engage in dialogue with those individuals. It's about talking about opportunities, about challenges, and also about who I am, right? What are some of the things and challenges that I'm seeing and opportunities that I'm seeing as a leader as I work with different teams?
And so what you're suggesting there is sort of that sense of awareness of how we need to approach difference differently, right? Awareness that the individual level is where we deal with inclusion. The I in inclusion is to ensure that we are at the individual level, because you can, at the institutional level, we can deal with this. At the interpersonal level, we can deal with this, and certainly at the individual level. So when it comes to inclusive leadership, we have to look at all three levels. And we are talking about the individual level today, going down to that baseline story, getting to know each individual. But the leader also has scope over the interpersonal level. And that's what we touched on earlier, Neil, where there are people within the organization who push back on perhaps changes, innovative ways of doing things, creative ways of doing it, other ways that we can include people. People feel threatened by inclusion in some ways. The leader has that interpersonal scope, and the leader is responsible for that as well. How do you deal with that at the interpersonal level, Neil?
I think it's interesting, Michelle, as we think about the impacts of the pandemic on this. And I've shared this story often. As we went through the pandemic, we did our town halls. And one of the things I got the best feedback on from a town hall was when we just, we let people, or we let the system choose, kind of scramble individuals into a room. And so we had individuals from different functional departments talking and interacting. And that was a hit within the organization. And it's very much reminded me of kind of the situation we were dealing in our personal lives. We spent a lot of time in our own homes. We spent a lot of time with our own families. We maybe didn't go to the family reunion to gain some different perspectives and thoughts and sharing from our colleagues. And I think from a structural, and I use that as an example in a story, Michelle, because I think it's up to us as leaders to create those opportunities where we interact, where we see different vantage points. And there's 1,000 different ways about going about doing that, but I think it's up to us as leaders to showcase and create those intersections where we can interact in different ways than maybe we normally are, and gain different exposures and experiences and learn from colleagues and customers.
Absolutely. Yes, it is indeed the leader's responsibility to facilitate peer-to-peer interactions in the same way that you learn so much when you're one-on-one listening to those stories, creating opportunities for teams to learn about each other across diverse perspectives. So not just, you know, the production team and the marketing team and the communications team, but that, as you say, mixing it up. Let's get to know each other and switching up who is getting to know each other so that over time, the organization learns about each other at the individual level. So one-on-one, the leader with each individual, there are some organizations that are far too large for that to even happen, but the leader can at least get to know at the individual level their direct reports and build out the team opportunity, the interpersonal connections, ongoing dialogue, ongoing story sharing. That's the leader's responsibility. And again, at the next level, the institutional level, the leader is absolutely responsible for identifying barriers at the institutional level. Barriers, whether it's how we structure work, whether it's how we structure our recruiting process, whether our onboarding, maybe how we support within in terms of mentoring, maybe how we promote within, maybe how we engage with vendors. What are the institutional blockages? This is the leader, and this is where bias consciousness becomes incredibly important, because it's hard when you're part of a system to take a step out and observe the system objectively, the very system that perhaps we created. How do you deal with that, Neil?
Oh, that's deep, Michelle. Around how one deals with that at the institutional level is a big level to tackle, right? But I think it goes back to us as leaders and back to learning and growing, right? What are we doing to facilitate change within our organizations, right? We know we need to change to solve the big problems of today that our businesses are facing, and quite frankly, our society is facing in some respects as well. So how do we think about the change that we need to make as leaders from an institutional level, even with simple things? You know, as we think about what is the definition of leadership that we need to bring, how do I create the passive direction, those structural forces that will enable a better organization and a better society as we roll forward?
Yes, and that means then the leader has to be a negotiator, to negotiate up to change, but also to negotiate with the people, the team, to at least make sure that your team is aware that you are aware of the structures that are in place that we need to change. And even if we can't change them today, that you're committed to this change and there's a plan and a pathway on which we're going to go. And I need your input, your participation in this change. I think sometimes leaders are not as transparent with information. Again, it's about communication, and we're not connecting and engaging people who may give us more time, may be more patient with us to move the ball forward. When we don't demonstrate that part of us becomes a real challenge, because inclusive leadership, as the research suggests, has some of the benefits that you touched on earlier, and I'm going to let you close out with those benefits. It's smarter teams. They talk about better decision-making, better problem solving, better financial gains, of course, customer satisfaction, employee retention. I know you touched on this, but the research is suggesting employee retention, performance, commitment, motivation, creativity, innovation, engagement, and well-being improve under inclusive leaders. And I know you touched on earlier, the Great Resignation, this phenomenon of quiet quitting. And I wonder the extent to which you believe that we are noticing some connection between the inability to develop this skill, the unwillingness to develop the skill, the lack of awareness that you don't have the skill. To what extent is the is inclusive leadership impacting what we're seeing, this great resignation, the quiet quitting? What do you think?
I think it's huge. I think before, when I was going through the school system many years ago, Michelle, they would maybe say soft skills. I would say this is necessary at this point in juncture in our society.
Necessary. And so when you think about the concept of quiet quitting, what's happening within the organization, how can leaders within a space use skills to engage with the people who are quiet quitting, to notice it before, to be preemptive, to support it? Because quiet quitting affects productivity, it affects people's well-being, it affects everything. So how can leaders, because these people who are quiet quitting are probably the people on the fringes of the organization, or who are even in senior leadership roles, but are not actually included. They're hearing about the decisions afterwards. They're noticing things shifting and happening, but they're not part of the conversation. And that's where we know that inclusive leadership is not just one thing, it's a matter of a lot of things. But how do we ensure that we're reaching these people using inclusive leadership strategies? What do you think on the ground, Neil?
Be bold is one. Talk to
Yes.
different people, right? We often think about, high performers, low performers in the middle, right? Talk to all of them. Do stay interviews, right?
Yes.
What does it take?
Yeah.
What does it take to stay in the organization, right? Ask those questions, do those things, come at it from different angles, not only as a most senior level, but also other leadership levels in the organization, right? Have different people participate in these. I think it's about being bold. I think it's about talking to different individuals and teams at all levels, not just the good, but also the maybe more challenged that we face. And I think it's about, you mentioned kind of naming things and being open. Well, we want our team members to stay. So how do we think about staying within the organization? I asked individuals recently on this topic, and I started it this way, Michelle. I said, let's talk about your passions and interests. Before we even talk about the work of the organization, let's talk about your passions and interests first. Let's establish that.
And how did that work out for you?
It created quite a dialogue, right? Quite a dialogue of seeing the individual not only from a work perspective, but from a full society perspective, from a member in our community, right? We learned a ton about one another, and we were able to share back and forth about lived experiences and passions and interests, and how we relate those back to performance in the business.
How did that impact you on an individual level as a leader, listening to these different stories and so on? What changed for you?
I'm reminded, Michelle, in those situations, just how big this world is, how beautiful it is, and how much I don't see of it, right? I live my life. I've got, the family around me, the friends around me, the city I live in, but there's so much more out there than that. And this exposed that for me.
And, the point that you've just made around how we live in our bubbles and assume that the bubble we live in is a true representation of the world is part of the bias that we hold, which impacts everything else around us, and really is having a massive impact on our ability to grow and become more inclusive as leaders, because we see it in that little bubble. And the story is that we enjoy working with people who look like us, sound like us, have been through the same experiences as us. That affinity bias really shows up in the workplace more than anything else. I recently read an article, and they had interviewed a CEO about inclusive leadership. And he says, I think I'm really inclusive. He has 10 direct reports. 9 of them look exactly like him, and there's 1 female. And he says, I do a really good job. I make sure that I hear all their perspectives. I'm a very inclusive leader. And so there is diversity of thought, there is inclusiveness, and there are many things, because at the individual level, there are many ways that he's probably being inclusive of that 10 team. But the broader context, when you step outside of that bubble, that does not at all reflect anything that we call inclusive. And so it's about that commitment we talked about at the beginning, the intentionality, but it requires integrity. It requires integrity. And you talked about accountability, Neil, and I feel like accountability to self is the highest form of integrity. It's being true to yourself, knowing that this actually is not inclusive. I can see that it's not. I really don't want anybody to know that I know. I will not go telling anyone. I'm not prepared to have a conversation about this. And I hope nobody brings it up, but I can tell deep inside of me that this is not inclusive. And I am going to make a commitment to working through this, to develop the cultural humility, to develop the communication skills, to go out and collaborate with others, to connect, to include, right? To go through, to learn different insights from other people, different perspectives, and to get help, because no one leader should be responsible for 70% of how people feel within the organization. That load you need to share, and the people within the organization need to be clear that I'm sharing this load. I'm sharing this load. The leader is really important in the organization. I want to leave you with another piece of the research, which I think you'll find interesting. And it says that when teams view the leader as inclusive, 17% are more likely to report that they're a high-performing team. 20% more likely to report that they have the high-quality decision-making processes. 29% more likely to report that they behave collaboratively. So the perception of the leader being inclusive increases even attendance in the workplace. And that means this skill is hitting the company's bottom line across the scope. And so this skill then becomes a non-negotiable skill. But clearly, when we're thinking about learning how to bring complex ideologies, identities, individual interests, needs, goals, lived experiences into one space and saying everything is given equitable value, contribution, care, respect, nurturance, and the trajectory to be, that needs work. And that is why it's so important that we're not sitting and thinking we've got this, but that we're out collaborating with each other, sharing ideas, sharing perspectives. We really need to roll up our sleeves and get back to the design phase, to design, to redesign, to think, to rethink, and to challenge our own selves, our own assumptions, challenge our teams, and challenge our institutions. Inclusive leadership operates at the individual, interpersonal, and institutional levels. And the leader is the one person who has the scope to run the gamut from individual, interpersonal, and institutional. So a lot of weight rests with the leader. And it's no wonder how people feel. 70% rests on the shoulders of the leader. And so we want to invite our leaders to continue to come and join us for these conversations, and to come and join us as well for the program that Schulich is offering. That program starts November 7. We'll have another conversation with another leader on October 11. And I'm going to try to make sure we have post in the chat this information for you. And I want to take time to thank Joanne for being on here with us. And Joanne will stay behind to take any questions you have and clarify any information. And I want to say a big thank you, Neil, because sitting and having a conversation about inclusive leadership is putting yourself out there. It's being vulnerable. It's exposing yourself. It is a risk. And I'm grateful that you're demonstrating that this is leadership. It's putting ourselves out there and taking those risks in order to learn, in order to help others learn. And I'm really grateful for your participation. Thank you, Neil. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Please continue to share your ideas with us as we go through the series. And any questions you have, please please share those with Joanne and she will support that. I'm Michel Shah. Again, thank you so very much for this conversation. See you again October 11 for the second in the series. Over to you, Joanne. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. So happy you took the time today. I want to thank Neil and Michelle for this awesome session. I am the Senior Education Advisor with Schulich, and I work with individuals and organizations to establish, determine what type of training programs are suitable for the individual and also for the company. I will follow up with all of you after this session, and I'll be happy to answer any additional questions. We do have tuition savings for this program. If your organization would like to send a group of people, I'll be happy to share those tuition savings with you. There's also a Canada Ontario job grant that is available to organizations, and I will share that information with you as well. I think that's it for today. As Michelle mentioned, the program will start on November the 7th. It will run through to December the 18th for a total of 3 days of study. And I will send you a breakdown of what those dates and times look like. So I hope you can join us. Thanks once again, Michelle and Neil. Thank you so much. And we'll chat again soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.